And we're back. This is the third segment of episode 376 of the Colombia Calling podcast. I'm Richard McColl, here your host, as always. Our very special guest this week is Andres Bermudez, who is a journalist, investigative reporter. He worked in the the peace office under the peace accords. He's written books about the peace accords and transitional justice. And this week we want to discuss what's going on with the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, so the special jurisdiction for peace. But first and foremost, Andres, thank you so much for coming on the Colombia Calling podcast.
Thank you very much, Richard, for having me. It's a pleasure.
No, the pleasure is mine, and of course you've got a difficult task ahead of you, is to follow in the footsteps of Sergio Guzman for episode 375, which by far and away about the protests in Colombia has been the most popular podcast in just a few short days. So you have to bring your A game today, Andres.
Very happy to try.
Yeah, there we go, Andres. So hang on, you are an investigative journalist and you do environmental journalism, and what is principally at this moment of interest to me, and of course your background working in the Peace Commission and so on, is the website justiceinfo.net. You put out some really in-depth articles, and of course it warns you beforehand, 8-minute read, 10-minute read, but really in-depth articles about what is going on with the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, so the special jurisdiction for peace, or what people here call the HEP. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the background of the HEP, the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, and what's going on.
So I write about this. Justice Info, as you were saying, is a Swiss-based website which believes that the best way the journalism can contribute to transitional or international criminal justice is to explain these issues in a sort of, maybe pleasant's not the good word, but in an agreeable way, while at the same time being able to convey the complexity of many of these issues. Because I think one of the things that happens, and it happens a lot in Colombia, is that these complex issues get overly simplified. People just want a black or white scenario of what's happening. They have very simplistic opinions about it. And these are complex issues. So what we do is we write about those. And for me, the importance of this is because Colombia's transition from peace, from armed conflict, 52-year-long armed conflict, to peace, which is a transition that's going to last somewhere between 10 or 15 or maybe even 20 years, is by far one of the most transformational processes that the country has faced in, I would say, its entire history. So that's why, for me, it is so important to be able to tell the stories of what's happening in the transitional justice system, which is one of the cornerstones of that transition, in a complex, nuanced way.
And so, I mean, we're talking about this, and of course, you're going to mention transitional justice a lot. If you could give a brief overview of what transitional justice means for some, I think most of my listeners will know, but to put it into context for this podcast, that would be really helpful.
So basically, most countries that have undergone any form of transition, whether it's from autocracy or dictatorships to democracy, or from armed conflicts to peace, have faced this question, this dilemma of, what are we going to do to enable this transition? Which of the victims' rights are we going to prioritize, whether it's truth, or whether it's justice, or whether it's redress? You can see South Africa tried it out, saying, we're going to put most of our eggs in the basket of truth. Other countries, have tried redress. Other countries have tried strictly justice. Some have tried to mix them up, but in general, they tried to privilege one over the other. Colombia did a very different thing. Colombia said, because obviously times have changed and we've learned the lessons of other places, what works, what doesn't. But this time around, Colombia, when we negotiated the 2016 landmark peace deal with FARC, and a lot of things, were new, or at least were different. Like, we have the Rome Statute, we have the International Criminal Court, we have much higher standards, not just internationally, but also nationally. And the question was, well, what are we going to do? And Colombia basically conceived and decided to implement a very comprehensive justice transitional justice system that tries to do all of these things at the same time. Basically, it pits, the four main rights that victims have and tries to do sort of like address them at the same time. So it's basically trying to establish or clarify the truth of what happened. It's trying to bring justice concerning mostly, the human rights violations that happened, mass atrocities over such a long period of time. It's trying to redress victims in a sense of trying not just to, repair a damage that has been done, but basically help them rebuild their life projects. And overall, much more globally, try to guarantee that this does not happen again, what we call non-recurrent. So all of this working together should help us basically clear these obstacles and move forward in a reconciled way. And to do this, it created this transitional justice system, which has sort of like four legs. Each of them does a different thing. The main structure there is the special jurisdiction for peace, what we Colombians call very simplistically the HEP, because that's the acronym. That's basically a special tribunal, which is going to try those most responsible of the most serious war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's going to do it in a special way, which I think we'll address in a minute. There's also a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which many countries have had, and it's basically trying to establish what happened and trying also to look forward. What lessons can be drawn from our past. It does so in what scholars and people working in this call an extrajudicial way, logic, which means basically you can go tell them things and these are not going to, be brought back against you legally. There's also a smaller agency that's called the Unit to Search for People that have been deemed missing, which basically is trying to clarify what happened to roughly 100,000 Colombians whose fate is not yet known. And there's finally a government-based redress program for victims, which has been part of the country since actually 2011. That was sort of like our first transitional justice mechanism, and that was ongoing since a few years before the peace deal materialized. Wow. So all of them together are working to be able to bring truth, redress, and justice to victims. And we have a whole amount of victims in Colombia, and that's also very important. We officially have 9 million victims of armed conflict in Colombia, individually identified over a period of time that begins in 1985. So we're not even counting what happened before that, but that's roughly one sixth or one out of every 6 Colombians.
It is. I've long said that every Colombian is at some level in their family affected by the conflict. Some level. I mean, when you go back to looking at that documentary that Jesus Abad Colorado did with my friend Kate Horn and El Testigo, and you just saw him taking, I think it was his great aunt or his aunt, back to the countryside, and this is where the liberals or the conservatives, and but I'm fascinated now. This point that you brought up, that you've backdated to 1985. It's not going to go further back than 1985. That's where we're starting.
It's very difficult to go further back in time, but as you say, violence has been a constant presence in Colombian history, not just, let's say, recent or semi-recent history. Every family has been marked, and we're also, anyways, we're not. For example, I'm not a direct victim of the armed conflict, but that does not mean that we are not traumatized as a whole, as a society. I do think there's a lot of psychosocial and emotional damage that we've gone through, and I think that even shows in the polarization that we see these days and people's aggressiveness, and this has permeated our entire lives. But a peace deal, obviously things are not going to change from one day to another, but these are all small steps that we can do to sort of like heal and move forward.
Well, I think, and I've discussed this with others and writers, in fact, and we say that Colombia is traumatized. There's a collective trauma in this nation, but also what you said there is it's not going to change from one day to the next. This has been one of my great frustrations, having studied the peace accord and other peace deals around the world and conflicts. This has been one of my great frustrations. Was it that Colombians were sold the idea of peace? It was just going to change everything and universally and straight away? Or is it because Colombians are impatient for peace? Because I think that's what a lot of the rejection of the peace deal was that, well, yeah, this is the Tal Paz de Santos, nothing has happened. But it takes 15 years or 2 generations for this to come through. So I don't know. This wasn't, I feel it wasn't explained to the general population. I mean, as you worked in the very entrails of the system itself, what do you feel about this?
I mean, there's many things that happened, and we probably could have explained it much better. But I do think, not the whole of government really, but the people working at the Peace Commissioner's office were doing a tremendous job of trying to explain this. But it's, there's still one thing that's true. We do have the world's longest peace agreement. It's a Guinness World Record for sure, at 310 pages long. Yeah. Originally 297, and then up to 310 pages after the renegotiation, after our failed plebiscite. So, explaining such a long document is also complex, and many people want, just simplistic versions of things. And there's always, I always remember this cartoon where there's sort of a Q on one side and a Q on the other side, and one says simple lies and the other says complex truths, and you have people obviously queuing on the simple lies section of the cartoon. And there's a lot of things happen. There's a lot of things, it's a very comprehensive agreement where everything sort of is meshed together. And some actors in Colombian society think, or, would like to think that you can sort of separate some from the others. And for example, basically withhold the chance for former combatants to run for office eventually. And, that's, you need those incentives to bring them out of war. And if you take those incentives away, it's just going to be very difficult. Or they don't want them to go to prison. And that's one tough thing in Colombia, because I think I don't have any facts for this or any evidence, but I think Colombia is a country with a very strong legalistic culture, and where we equate justice to prison, which is, not necessarily true. The only form of justice is not being in jail. And a lot of people didn't want to understand that a more complex system could be put into place, where you could have different types of sanctions, and we'll discuss that in a minute. But where overall the entire point of the system was to help bring victims these 4 fundamental rights they have, and they demand from us all the time, which are truth and justice, and redress or reparations, and non-recurrence. And in that process, we did amazing things, in the sense that the Colombian peace process really was, and people are studying this today, was very innovative in a lot of ways. And one that is fundamental, and it hits the nerve of what we're discussing, is this is the first time ever in the world where an armed group discusses with the government the design of a transitional justice system, to which that armed group is then, is afterwards going to go forward. This had never happened before. No armed group, illegal group, had ever negotiated that they would go before justice. That simply, had never happened in countries where they set up tribunals. Either it happened afterwards, or it happened without, these consultations. Yeah. But we sort of underestimate these kinds of things, and we're very, we're very privy to these petty infighting. But I don't think that's something that is extraordinary just to Colombia. And I have a lot of friends in South Africa who were telling us, everybody sort of sees the South African transition today as a done deal, as something that was, relatively or very successful. But you always sort of forget that it, at the moment where you were in, you were navigating this transition, it was always rocky. It was always tumultuous. And I'm sure if you asked people in Ireland and Northern Ireland, they would probably say the same. Like, these are rocky, complex roads that have, sort of like a roller coaster of emotions. And I think we're probably on the lower part of that roller coaster, but we'll continue advancing. And I don't think it's something that is, neither definitive nor something that is, sort of like condemned to not be able to work. I think, I am, usually are an optimistic person, and I think this is just part of what happened. We probably could have done, better with a different government that has not been hostile to the peace deal. We would probably be better off if we didn't have such a divisive plebiscite. But that's life, and we have to deal with the hand we dealt ourselves. And I still think we're well headed in our transition.
I think so. I mean, it's such a complete document, and even when it went back for the revision to then get passed through Congress, and this is what I say to people who oppose it. It's like, well, and they discuss the sort of illegality of that sort of move. It went back to Congress with the changes that the party in opposition demanded. So therefore, what went through Congress afterwards was the revised document agreed by all. And that's my point. But you were going to mention, and I know you, the sort of penalties that people could face for their crimes, and I think that would take us into more conversation. So you did say, is like, okay, so the FARC are involved in the conversations about the justice that they are going to see and going to let's be privy to what if and when they're found guilty. But of course, I guess some of the things is if you've committed crimes against humanity, you're going to jail, right? Or if you are found to have committed crimes and not admit them before the tribunal, you're also going to get a higher penalty. I mean, can you perhaps explain a little bit about this?
Sure. There's basically sort of like two ideas, underlying the Colombian transitional justice system. The first one is that what we're going to try to do is a transitional justice system that sort of balances two types of justice. One that is based on retribution or punishment, and the other one which has, deals with reparations and redress, or a more restorative form of justice. We're trying to do both. We're trying to have penalties, punishments, but we're also trying to ensure that those penalties have a social meaning. Basically, that as you are paying your penalty, you're on your sanction. That sanction has to be able to also satisfy these victims' rights. Like, it's not just, we don't want people to rot in jail. That's not the point. The point is that the penalty can also help people heal. The penalty can also help people find missing truths that they've longed for a long time. And the penalty can also help repair entire communities. That's the first underlying premise. The other one is that basically, and that's why I forgot to say, that's why we didn't even call it the transitional justice chapter in the peace agreement. It's called the chapter about victims, because as you can see, we sort of like changed the emphasis from the perpetrators to the victims. This is centered on victims. The entire point of this is the victims, not the perpetrators. This is not designed to help them sort of like solve their legal conundrum. And the other premise, now when you look at it from the point of view of the perpetrators, the people who are going before the tribunal, which are not just FARC members, but anyone who committed these mass atrocities during the armed conflict, like, for example, some military, some other actors who have never faced justice before, and they can have the incentive of coming here and having these sort of like more lenient sanctions, but on the condition that they comply with what the transitional justice designed. And this is the second underlying premise. Like, to be able to qualify for a more lenient sanction, you basically have to fill three boxes. You have a checkbox, and you have to do all three. You have to, first of all, admit your responsibility. You have to acknowledge, own up to what you did. It is not conditional. You cannot come before the HEP and say, I want a lenient sanction, but I am innocent. I did nothing. Prove it. No way. That doesn't work. Second condition is you have to contribute to truth. What you tell either the tribunal itself or the the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has to help uncover truths that are missing, has to allow us to understand what happened better. And three, you have to directly help repair victims. You have to help victims sort of like get back on their feet, whether through material redress, or through work, or through symbolic acts that basically help bring back victims, the dignity that they lost. So only if you do those three things, if you check those three boxes, acknowledge your responsibility, contribute to truth, and help redress victims, you may qualify for one of those special sanctions. And the difference is, basically between paying 5 to 10 years in a non-prison setting, which is still yet to be exactly determined what it's going to look like. We don't have that entire answer even now, 5 years after the peace deal. The tribunal is going to have to set that with the first decision, which is coming very soon, or paying anywhere from between 15 to 20 years in prison. So that's the main difference. You either get, for the worst crimes, 5 to 8 years in a non-prison setting, but you do those three things we said. You acknowledge your responsibility, you help tell the truth, and you help redress victims, or you get 15 to 20 years in a prison setting. The only basically benefit you would get in that case is you get sort of a shorter prison sentence, because you already laid down your weapons, and that sort of, that's taken into account. You would have gotten much more in the ordinary criminal justice system. But that's basically, so we have those two tracks. And as you go to the HEP, you decide which track you're going through. You're going to go through the left track, which is more lenient, but gives you those three conditions, or you're going to go to the right-hand track and, face prison.
Simple lies and complex truths is your thing. Quickly, but I'm going to jump in. What's the first decision that's coming soon?
So what happened last week was very transformational, because and for Colombians especially, it's highly symbolic. It obviously, sadly, or this happens, got a bit lost with all the ruckus around the protests, and everybody's thinking about protests. But this, something very, very important happened. Seven FARC former commanders formed the upper echelon of FARC, which they called the secretariat, but it's basically the highest ring of power within FARC. They owned up to the accusation which the HEP laid down on concerning kidnappings. And kidnappings have been, this is very symbolic, because kidnappings were by far FARC's most infamous crime. It was, we were on national, before riots right now, we were on the international press for years, because we had, there were people who were held as hostages in the jungle for as long as 14 years in some cases. People held, behind sort of like prison bars. Some people were comparing them to concentration camps in the Amazon. People were held in, very, very, very poor conditions for a very long time, everywhere, everything from politicians to soldiers and policemen to humble local townspeople. And so basically the FARC, the tribunal, laid down its first accusation in late January, after 2 years or a year and a half of investigation. And it pointed out that FARC had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, not just because of kidnapping, but also with a series of connected crimes, connected to kidnapping. Some people who died for example, during their, their time as hostages, people who were submitted to torture or to cruel treatments and degrading treatments, to even sexual violence. And after FARC had sort of, I guess it was 2 months in the end, for them to think, to read this indictment, to think about it. And there was this big question: what are they going to do? Will they go, through the left-hand path, or will they go through the right-hand path? And their answer finally came last Friday. And their decision was they owned up to everything. They accepted the entire indictment, which basically means they accepted having committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, something that had never happened before. It took them 28 years basically to do this gigantic U-turn on, the way they referred to kidnappings, which they were very, arrogant and unrecognizing of before. And little by little, gradually, this is, and so that's a very interesting thing as well, process of transformation in which now they acknowledge not just that what they did was wrong, and they have very strong sentences about that. They said, we know we didn't make mistakes. We know we committed crimes against, war crimes. And in the process, which is even more interesting for me, they are now recognizing the full scope of horror of, that their victims had to endure. So that's why this was just so important. We still don't know what the penalties will be, but we're guessing obviously that they're going through the left-hand path. They chose the left-hand path. They are starting to admit their responsibility. We now have to obviously see that they also continue contributing to truth and redress victims.
I think it's fascinating, isn't it? Because for so long, what do they call it? Economic detentions or economic something
Retentions, yeah.
retentions, yeah. They would, and it was so cynical to hear that. And
It was very cynical.
It was Mauricio El Medico
Yep.
who did say, that it was a big error, didn't he? He was the one who admitted a few years.
He was
back.
one of the first ones. Yeah, exactly.
He said it was that was when we really lost our way. But this about the kidnapping, and unfortunately because of the protests and the paro nacional going on, it really didn't make the news, or at least not, a little bit here and there. And I saw it and I went, this is the biggest thing.
This is major.
This is major. They've admitted to something that Colombia is identifiable with. So people, you're going to Colombia, don't get kidnapped. That's
absolutely
that kind of reaction. It's huge. And what I'm now fascinated about is when this ruling in the tribunal comes out, will they say then, okay, Pastor Alape, one of the guerrillas or whatever, you have gone down the left path, you've ticked the 3 boxes, you guys have admitted this. There's a possibility that he could be sent to, for some prison type penalty for, say, up to 8 years.
Non-prison setting.
But you know
years.
what I mean. Non-prison setting, but it could be. I mean, it could be pretty miserable, or like hard labor or something. It could be pretty.
This is still something that hasn't been fleshed out in the end. Like the peace negotiation, that's something I wrote about in my first book on the peace process, on the sort of like the toughest conceptual debates in the negotiation, and then the creative solutions that were brought forward to solve them. And this, latter part of the sanctions is one that the peace negotiation was not able to solve, like the exact nature of what it was going to look like. There were some ideas, but it was tough, Then the Constitutional Court also sort of like kicked the ball forward and said, everything's fine, we approve everything, everything's constitutional, but it's going to be the HEP that has to decide this, what exactly it looks like. And the HEP has taken 2 years and hasn't solved this yet. My guess, but this is just an informed guess, this is not, I don't have any inside information, but in the end, it should look like something like what we call in Spanish, I'm not sure if this applies in English, sort of like agricultural or rural penal colonies. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, incidentally, is what Marta Lucia Ramirez,
the vice president,
back then just a conservative politician, and former boss of the head peace negotiator, because she was Sergio Jaramillo's boss for quite a long time, because he wrote the democratic security policy for her at the beginning of Uribe's government. She said that's what she proposed. She said, let's make them look like agricultural penal colonies. That's what she said during the renegotiation. It was difficult to flesh it out back then, but that's one of the ideas that has been sort of like on the cards for a long time. Incidentally, also curiously, she was probably the most how to say this, the most good student during the negotiation phase. She put out a bunch of proposals, very well fleshed out. All of them were accepted. The head peace negotiators took, we had all, the peace team had sort of organized this on these Excel sheets, and they took everything to her at the end and showed her how everything she had proposed had been integrated into the peace accord. And she said, yes, it's true. She acknowledged that had happened. And then she said, I'm still going to not back it. So, you can see that, people chose politics, short-term politics over sort of like, or politicking over good politics and, long-term ones. But that's probably what it's going to look like.
I could see that being the ideal, solution to this. And of course, we need to know, and people out there need to know, that Marta Lucia Ramirez, who will take a run at the presidency in 2022, we imagine, she was, let's say, fundamental in the creation of that idea. Let's remember that. But of course, as you say, politicking. Well, she was jostling.
She doesn't want to own up to that.
No, she won't. But there'll be documentation. There will be. It will. So I'm curious now, talking about this, and when you mentioned 100,000 people missing in the Colombian conflict, does this include the these sort of what would you call them, mass grave sites underneath the cemeteries themselves, like in Dabeiba, Antioquia, where they've started unearthing victims of, I guess they're the false positive victims or victims of massacres.
There's also, the universe of people that are deemed missing in Colombia is quite diverse, and that also explains why the number sort of keeps going up. I've never really understood how you can establish that kind of number with such certainty. I think the working number during the peace negotiation was something like 45,000, but then now the unit says it's above 100,000. But basically, this includes at least four, I would say, like, just to give you a couple of examples, 4 or 5 very different profiles of victims. It includes people like what you were describing, people who were executed extrajudicially in are ill-named false positives, which were basically extrajudicial executions carried out by state agents. But we also have people who were kidnapped and who never returned home, who potentially died during captivity or not, but whose families still have no idea what happened to them. And that's, for example, one that falls squarely on FARC's shoulders. And their response to the indictment begins trying to give information about as much as they remember of many of these people. But there's also people who, for example, even may have belonged to armed groups and died at some point during combat, and nobody ever, or not combat, militias in cities, and then disappeared. They could have been executed by paramilitaries. They could have, something happened to them, and their relatives also do not know what happened to them. So, it's sort of a very different, same crime, same horrible crime, because families are sort of, in this limbo in which they do not know what happened to them. In some cases, they might still have even hopes of finding them. A couple of bodies have already been recovered, which is something that is very important also for victims to be able to to heal, to give closure to their family dramas and traumas. Pain is not going to go away, but it might change. And that's why this very small, interesting unit is working on trying to, at some point find as much information as it can to give to each family who has a disappeared victim.
We see, obviously, as you say, the false positives. Most people here will know about that. But you have the military being brought up on these, and then you have, let's say, the FARC being brought up on the issue of child soldiers and kidnappings. Both sides are being hammered hard by this HEP, by the Jurisdicción. And I mean, I keep saying that to people again who are against it, saying, "Oh, it's not delivering justice. Everything's against the military." It's not. It really is being very effective on both sides so far. And as far as it could, it's reach right now. But what is my curiosity is, so we got the military on one side. Definitely, there are savage, nefarious acts that they've carried out since 1985, and of course the guerrillas, well publicized, well documented, crimes against humanity and so on that they've done. But where did the paramilitaries fit into this? In this kind of in between? Because I suppose, supposedly they put down their weapons. What is it, in 2002? I want to say.
Yeah, but between 2003 to 2006. Well, basically, one of the things that hit home when the peace negotiations were taking place was, this can't be just about FARC in one important sense, and it's Colombia's 9 million victims, which back then were obviously less because we've obviously continued counting. We're counting not in the sense that a lot of victims are. I mean, we still obviously have human rights violations taking place presently, but a lot of people have even come forward years after they're being victimized. So we've gotten better at counting. For example, the HEP case on kidnappings believes that in total 21,000 people might have been kidnapped by HEP, and 2,500 of them, which is a small percentage of the total universe perhaps, but that's a bunch of people, have already registered as parties to the case. So you have 2,500 victims reading FARC's documents on kidnapping and saying, asking specific questions like, what happened to my husband? What was the last thing you heard from my father, etc. And that's very important because obviously participation in the system is fundamental. But we realized, of course, we have these other actors as well. The paramilitaries did not come into the transitional justice for one fundamental reason. They already had their transitional justice mechanism called Justicia y Paz, Justice and Peace, back in between 2008 2010, and it had interesting results. It was a very lengthy judicial process because people were tried individually, which is a very, very complicated thing. And this obviously everything we've done before has served as a lesson to what we did now. But what we did now was also very different. We now have macro cases, which basically sort of like bring one entire criminal pattern together and try everyone within a structure on that crime at the same time. So, for example, that's why the first indictment on kidnappings was against 8 FARC leaders, former leaders. One of them, ironically, died just the day before HEP announced its indictment. So 7 were the one to own up. And over the coming months, it's going to have connected minor indictments targeting the leaders of the regional structure, military structure, or blocs that FARC had. Similarly, the case on extrajudicial executions by the military is is sort of basically identifying those most responsible in each of the military units, and then finally on a national level. One is sort of like going from top, the FARC case on kidnappings is going top bottom. The other one is going bottom up. So it's going to begin with the military structures individually and then going up to, sort of hierarchy, the top hierarchy. But in the end, that's what it's doing. And we have a much better chance of delivering justice in a country that has seen so many mass atrocities this way. But a lot of people do say that this is impunity. And, the best way to answer that is, most people haven't even seen this, but have you ever seen the record of the ordinary criminal justice trying these issues? I remember having looked at, obviously finding the numbers for all of this is very difficult, but Colombia has some very good researchers who are trying to put numbers down to this. And I remember having looked at the numbers of sentences and rulings in cases of child recruitment and sexual violence in the context of the armed conflict, and the number of cases that have not reached the decision was more than 90%. So the question or this idea that there's impunity is just falls flat when you realize that the ordinary criminal justice in many cases doing a lot of hard work. For example, in kidnapping it had advanced, but it had to go case by case, not even perpetrator by perpetrator, criminal case by criminal case. And in a country of 9 million victims, where many of them have suffered, different victimization, it's just very difficult. So this has a much better chance of delivering justice than the ordinary criminal justice system that many people, sort of like would like it to shoulder the entire burden, but it's just not well prepared and unable to deliver there. And so because of this realization, we also understood that we had to give the opportunity of going before the transitional justice to victims of other actors who had committed crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity, or very serious crimes, and had not had this chance before. And that basically means the military and maybe also policemen, but the state forces. And this is very important because it doesn't just mean that you are going to hold them accountable. You are, but it also gives them the possibility of owning up to things and having a more lenient sanction, but only if you tick those boxes. And that is much more repairing, redressing, and fulfilling to victims. Obviously not to everyone. It's very hard to please everyone, but it's very important. And this is why it's also so ironic that some political sectors have tried to sort of push the narrative that the peace agreement degraded the military, and that the peace agreement equated guerrillas with soldiers, when it's giving soldiers and policemen who committed crimes the chance to own up to their crimes and have a shorter prison sentence. It's going to help them sort of clarify their legal situation, which is the biggest irony when these political sectors use this joker card, which is just ideological. In the end, they're actually hindering and hampering these soldiers' opportunity to go before the transitional justice. Instead of helping them, they're actually,
they're creating a problem for them, because the truth will come out. I mean, the truth always comes out at some stage, hopefully sooner rather than later in some of these cases. But the truth there's always some documentation, there's always something or some witness or someone somewhere who will come forward out of a benefit, probably. But I think you've covered it quite in depth. What I was obviously most taken by the issue of kidnapping because of the importance of it, and that what it means to Colombia, kidnapping. And so I'd like to thank you as well for also shooting down some of the fallacies of what the opposition to the HEP say, the impunity and so on, and the lack of justice there. I understand that you've just released, because we're recording beforehand, but you're just released something about violence against environmental defenders, which of course is incredibly important right now. I'm thinking of Berta Cáceres in Honduras or El Salvador?
Honduras, yes.
Yeah. I'm thinking of that. This is the kind of thing you've just released?
We've been working for 2 years now on a cross-border project documenting violence against environmental defenders in 12 Latin American countries now.
Wow.
It's called Land of Resistance. You can see it in English as well. It has an English version.
Because, of course, Latin America is the worst place for...
Latin America it has a very, very interesting and dramatic paradox. It's at the same time the most biodiverse region in the world. And it is also the region most dangerous to environmental leaders and communities.
Just it's a bit bizarre stuff. How do you, finally, a type of digression here as we have to wrap this up. You've been working on the, on the peace process. You write about it, I mean, with such fluency, obviously, because you've worked on it right at the beginning. And people, I recommend anyone look at Andres's work, Andres Bermudez, justiceinfo.net. You'll find it in English and in Spanish, and I believe in French too, right? If this is
agree.
But and then 2 years on violence against environmental defenders and activists. How do you stay upbeat? Because this is hardcore stuff that you're working on.
No, I mean, I think maybe the example of violence against environmental defenders is sort of a different thing there. But most of my work and a lot of my work has tried to understand how victims have been coping and have been reconstructing their lives. And that's why the usual things I cover on the ground as much as I can are how people, for example, have substituted coca crops for other alternative options, how victims have forged ahead with projects that have helped them rebuild their lives. So in general, I've been mostly concentrating on understanding directly from their perspective, how have they forged ahead, and that's what gives me optimism.
Okay, well, that's awesome. That's great to hear, because of course this is pretty heavy stuff. But let me take this moment to say thank you so much to Andres Bermudez for his time to share a little bit. I think we only got a tiny percentage of his knowledge on the Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, the HEP, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. But it really was quite revealing, and you've put to bed some of the fallacies that people out there will say. And of course, don't believe everything you read on social media, because that's where the hate lives. That's the truth. That's where it is. And I wish you all the best of luck. And of course, I will be reading justiceinfo.net as soon as that first sentence is handed down, for the kidnapping case. I mean, this is pretty big. This is a defining moment for Colombia, I'd say.
Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you again, Andres, for your time. Check out justiceinfo.net. Check out the book. What's it called again? The book on the environmental defenders?
It's a project, Land of Resistance. You
Land of Resistance.
tierraderesistentes.com.
Excellent. So thank you again. This has been episode 376 of the Colombia Calling podcast. I've been talking to Andres Bermudez. I've been Richard McColl, and this is another great episode. We'll be back next week talking further interesting things about Colombia. Thank you again, and bye-bye.